He served as press secretary to 2 U.S. presidents and been the confidant of probably one of the most powerful families in the world. After a 30-year career, he's thinking about writing his own autobiography. Hi, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on InnerVIEWS, our conversation with Peter Roussel. So is politics today broken, or is it working as it should?
I don't think politics will ever be broken. The system is viable. It's with us today, and hopefully it will be with us 200 years from now.
Are the best people getting into office? Are the best voices, the best thinkers leading us the best way across the board, not any particular office?
You would hope so. The difference between politics, at least in my view, politics today in 2004 versus when I first got in this in the early 60s is the cost to seek office. It is very expensive to run for public office now. It's a shame. I'm sorry that it is, but that probably is one thing that discourages some people from getting into the elective arena. And the other thing is, nowadays you have an instant global media exposure of people running for office, which you didn't have 30, 40 years ago when coverage was still dominated by print media primarily. And I think that probably discourages some people because they don't want to put their families through all that, and I can certainly understand that. But given those two factors, one can only hope, though, that good people won't refrain from submitting themselves for public office. And you hear people whine about politics all the time. Oh, I'm tired of politics, and we got so many crummy people in office. Well, I say to the person that's whining, whenever I hear that kind of whining, I say, look, I don't like it any better than you do, but if you don't like it, instead of whining about it, why don't you go do something about it? Why don't you get involved, either at your precinct level or you run for office? And then maybe we can, change the system in the way you want.
Now, you've been in politics, been around politics. Why haven't you ever run for office?
Well, I've given it serious thought several times, Ernie, and the answer is fate intervened each time that I got right up to the edge. The time I really considered it seriously was when I came back to Houston in 1976. After having served in the Ford White House, I kind of had it in my mind then that I would take a shot for Congress because I'd had the benefit of working for a congressman. I'd had the benefit of working in the White House. I'd worked at the United Nations. I had a perspective that I thought might be viable and useful as a congressional candidate and as a congressman. And I also had the benefit of seeing some of the things that worked and some of the things that didn't work while working for someone else in the political arena. What happened was, though, that Jim Baker decided to run for Attorney General of Texas in 1978, and I ended up helping run his campaign. I gave it some more thought right after that, and once again fate intervened because what happened was, and who could have predicted this, what happened was shortly after that, in April of 1981, I got a phone call one day and somebody said, hey, did you hear what just happened in Washington? I said, what? And they said, somebody just tried to shoot President Reagan and they shot your friend Jim Brady. And as a result of that, I was called back to Washington, invited back to Washington by Jim Baker to serve in the Reagan White House. So that kind of did it for me for seeking public office.
Well, you mentioned the White House, and I always wonder, it's such a machine. There's so many people there, so much behind the scenes. When the administration changes, when a president switches, does it really change what goes on in the White House that drastically? Can you feel the difference depending on the person sitting in that chair?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that doesn't change, and you hear it with every administration, be it Republican or Democrat. At least I think one of the first things I always hear every time a new administration comes in is, we're going to stop the leaks in this White House. There's not going to be any leaks. And I don't think that's ever happened. The leaks continue because it's one of the great indoor sports in Washington. I remember President Reagan one day, there was a leak story on the front page of the Washington Post, and he looked up at the ceiling in the Oval Office. He said, sometimes I wonder how this place holds the rain out. And another time he was looking at the front page of the Washington Post, and he said, there was a leak story in there. He said, one of these days I'd love to announce one of my programs first myself. So that is something that doesn't change. I think you're going to continue to have certain things and there's an underbase to Washington, a bureaucracy, let's face it, that remains there when administrations come and go. So that's why you have continuity of government, actually. So, the personalities change, certainly. The issues change. The priorities change. But life goes on in Washington.
Take me back. What got you interested in all of this?
Well, I guess I grew up in a show business family. My father was a drama and theater and music and film critic for the Houston Post. My mother was an actress. My sister was a ballerina. So I guess being all around all that, I had an interest kind of in entertainment, certainly. And I guess politics, there's a certain degree of entertainment in politics. And as I went through school, I developed a latent interest in the political world, although not an active one. I wasn't active really in any campaigns or anything, and I didn't know whether I was a Republican or a Democrat. And I grew up in a Democratic family, as did most kids in Texas in the 1950s. There was no Republican Party, and then one day in the 60s, I saw a guy running for the Senate, U.S. Senate in 1964, named George Bush. And I was a student at the University of Houston at the time, and I remember remarking to one of my friends, I said, boy, I sure like that guy and what he's saying and the way he's saying it. He's the kind of person I like to see in the political arena. And somebody said, well, you can't be for him. He's a Republican. And I said, well, you know something? If that means I got to be a Republican, I'm going to be for him. And that kind of whetted my interest. And then fate led me to a job early on out of college at an advertising agency in Houston that was doing work for Senator John Tower's 1966 reelection campaign. And I was asked to go out on the road and help write some ad copy for his commercials for him. And I was so naive, I said to the account executive that invited me to do this, I said, gee, Bob, I'm not sure I'm for Senator Tower. And he said, do you enjoy working at this ad agency? I said, oh, it's terrific. Everyone's very nice. He said, great, then you're for Senator Tower. And as a result of that, I really, the bug bit me, because then I met Tower's press secretary, a guy named Jerry Friedheim. And I said, hey, wait a minute, that's the job I want. How do I get a job like that? And he said, well, you go to Washington, because there's a lot of us in Washington. And ultimately, that led me to Washington. A few years later, a congressman from Houston named George Bush invited me to come to Washington and be his press secretary. So,
when you've mentioned it a couple times already, about having to be aligned with the politician, believing in what they believe in. Do you need to do that to do the job you do?
It helps, but you don't have to agree with them on every issue. You do have to have the conviction that you are comfortable representing their views and can advocate their views. Now, I've never agreed 100% with any politician that I've been around. I mean, we all have, I can't imagine anybody agrees with any politician 100% down the line. I always felt comfortable, though, overall with the positions of the people I represented and the policies I advocated. There was a case in shortly after President Ford took office. His first press secretary was a guy named Gerald Terhorst. Very respected writer, had been a reporter in Washington. He was Ford's first press secretary, and when Ford pardoned President Nixon, Jerry Terhorst resigned over that as a result of that, because he was opposed to that. And I respect his doing that. He felt that strongly about it. You know, something we used to get asked a lot when we do the briefing at the White House, and I've been asked it from the podium, is, well, what's your view on it? What's your personal view? And I never answered that question, because my job was not to give my personal views. My job was to convey the president's view.
How do you keep it separate, though? When they're asking you constantly, well, what do you think of this? How do you think that is? And you only have access to so much information. How do you know when you're bringing in your own feelings? How do you keep that so separate?
I think you have to, Ernie. Your view doesn't matter. What your view is out on that podium does not matter.
What about
the view that matters out there is the president's view, and you're conveying that with accuracy.
How do you convey it without interpretation, though?
Well, you do your best, and you do your homework. You study the issue, whatever it is. Now, Helen Thomas said something to me one time that I never forgot early on in my career there in the Reagan White House. One day she asked me a question I couldn't answer. And I felt bad about it, that I didn't know the answer. I almost felt embarrassed. And she could tell I felt a little funny about it. So later she came up to me and she said, listen, we don't expect you to know the answer to everything. No human being has that fount of knowledge. She said, what I do expect is this, though, that if I ask you a question, A, you will always answer truthfully. B, if you don't know the answer, you will say, I don't know the answer to that, Helen. And if you don't know the answer, you'll either say, but I'll try to get you an answer to that, or I've taken you as far as I can on that one, and you're going to have to seek that answer somewhere else. Now, that seemed to me a very fair marker that she laid down, and from then on, that's the way I did business with her, and we got along fine.
Okay, you though say she asked you to be honest and truthful with her. There are times you're going to know things, or there were times you knew things that you couldn't give to the press. Or do they keep you just, you knew what you could say?
Well, you quickly, it's like any job, you quickly develop an instinct about how far you can or should go on guiding the press on a particular issue. And yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, there are times when you are privy to more information than you need or that should be conveyed in some way. Now, that doesn't mean, that to me, that's different than lying or something like that. That's just, hey, I've taken you as far as I can on that one. That's being perfectly honest. In other words, and any good reporter knows what I'm saying. They know they're saying, hey, he knows something else, but he's just not going to take it any further, and I'll just have to go pursue this elsewhere.
Does the press ask too much? Are they too nosy sometimes?
Well, I'd be less than honest if I didn't say there were days and nights when I probably thought that. But, I came home here to Houston one time on a very brief vacation. You rarely get a vacation in the White House. But I came home and was discussing that very subject with my mother, who had been a reporter here in Houston in the 1920s and the 1930s. And I was kind of whining and feeling sorry for myself. I said, Mother, these reporters in the White House, they're relentless. They come at you night and day. You get home at night, 10 o'clock at your apartment, and the phone's ringing. They're still asking questions. It just never stops. She listened to all that, and finally she said, what are you complaining about? She said, that's their job, and that's your job. Mm-hmm. And if you don't like it, quit. And, I thought about it, and of course she was right. So I quit whining about it.
Okay, we're going to go back a little bit of ways, back to George Bush. So you were with George Bush when he was in the Senate. And that you continued with him, though, correct, into when he was the ambassador, or no?
Well, let me correct that. Unfortunately, George Bush never made it to the Senate. He ran for Senate twice, 64 and 70, and was defeated in both those elections. He ran successfully for Congress in 1966 and served 2 terms, 66 to 70. So I went to work for him in 1969 when he was a congressman. Worked for him there. We came back here to Texas in 70, ran for the Senate, lost to Lloyd Bentsen. In 71, President Nixon appointed him ambassador to the United Nations. Fascinating time to go to the United Nations because it was when the admittance to the United Nations of the People's Republic of China occurred, which the debate over that went on for about a year there. It was a fascinating exercise there. Couldn't have landed there at a more interesting time. And I must say, I went there with some trepidation when he first talked to me about going there. I was a political animal at that point. I wanted to stay in politics. And I said, the UN, that'll be, I'm just not into that. And he gave me a good piece of advice, though, at that point. He said that one time his father told him that sometimes the way you have a more interesting life is to occasionally reach out for the unknown and try something you haven't done before. You may find that you may fail, you may fall on your face, or you may not like it, but it may make your life more interesting than it would have been. And boy, in that case, he was absolutely right. Because the day our last day at the UN, we were walking down 45th Street there in New York, and we looked up at the U.S. mission there, and he said, at that time, he said, this has been the 2 most fascinating years of my life. And I agreed with him. It had been the 2 most fascinating years of my life. But to finish the succession there, we then went back to Washington for 2 years when he was named chairman of the Republican National Committee. All during Watergate, I might add, is when Watergate was going on. Of course, we had nothing to do with that, but he had to go back there and try and keep the glue on the Republican Party during a very, very difficult period in the history of that political party.
Right. Now, you were with him, though, when he found out that he wouldn't be Ford's vice president.
That's correct.
How did that play out?
What happened was, this was when he was serving as chairman of the Republican National Committee. Nixon resigns. Ford went in as president. There then began a typical Washington game, which is a speculation game about who Ford was going to name as vice president. And as the speculation swirled and continued, it kind of narrowed down to Nelson Rockefeller and George Bush, which I think was a great testimony to Bush, considering the job he was in at the time. And I remember when he went into that job, people saying, this is the end of the road for George Bush. chairman of the Republican National Committee during Watergate. What a thankless task. Who would want it? But you know, there's something to be said for taking on the tough ones during tough times. People respect that, and especially if you do as fine a job as I think he did under those circumstances. So finally the speculation did narrow down to the two of them, and finally one day he said, why don't we go up to Maine, up to Kennebunkport, and just wait it out up there, because there was nothing you could do. It was out of our control. And so we did. We went up to Kennebunkport, Maine, and we were sitting there on the porch of his house, which actually in those days was a house across the street from the one you see in the news in later years here. We were sitting there, and the phone rang, and it was President Ford telling him he'd selected Governor Rockefeller. And he hung up the phone, and interesting little footnote to that, a reporter, a camera crew from the local Portland station about 20 minutes later came up and was just standing down below by the porch, the only reporters there. And she kind of nudged me, it was a female reporter, and she said, could I ask Mr. Bush a question? And I said, yeah, I guess so. So she came up and she said, basically, I have one question. And he said, what is it? And she said, well, you don't, on the outside, you don't seem to be too upset about this. And I'll never forget his answer. He said, yes, but you can't see what's on the inside, which, you know, kind of said something.
What did you learn about him from that?
Learned he was, you know, he was a very human, sensitive individual. And it's been my good fortune because I've been associated professionally and personally with him, he and his family for so many years that, you know, I know him in a very personal way, and I know that personal side of him. And anybody that knows him well will tell you about that, and that he truly cares about people, and I've always called the Bushes non-big shot big shots. Yeah, they're big shots, but they don't act like it, and they never have. Yeah. And that's one of the things I really admire about them.
Now, you worked with W, though, during the time you were working for his father, correct?
First got to know W when I was working for his President Bush 43 now, as we call him, when I was working for his father in Congress. That's right. And then he campaigned with us during the 70 Senate race quite a bit. And then I didn't see him for a while after that because I went off to New York and back to Washington. And but would see him in the summers up in Maine, and we were good friends.
You always hear stories that nobody would have thought he would have ascended to what he did in time. Did you ever get the feeling, knowing him, he was somebody who would one day, I mean, I know at that point you wouldn't have even thought president, but would have ever made it to a position of such power?
You know, there's probably a lot of people that went to school with me that probably would have said the same thing about me, too. Yeah. You know, I'll tell you something on that. We used to play a lot of backyard football with George W. and Jeb, the brothers, and I played against him. I've been across the scrimmage line across from him. You know, you learn something about somebody when you look into their eyes across the scrimmage line in football. And even back that far, what I learned about him was, A, he wasn't a quitter. Boy, he was a fierce competitor. And I'd much rather have him with me than against me. And I have to believe that kind of conviction has steadied him well in later years and led him to what you're suggesting. Yeah. When maybe people years ago said, oh, gosh, you know, we'd never envisioned that George would end up president of the United States. And I'll tell you another situation, Ernie. I'll never forget on election night 1970 when his dad was losing the Senate race. We were over at the Shamrock Hotel, not far from where we're sitting right now. And it got to be late in the evening, and I was up in the room upstairs with his dad taking returns, and the sun was slowly setting on that campaign. And George W.'s job that night was to be on the phone getting returns from other areas of the state. And I was on the other end of the phone, and I said, George, we're going to be down in a little while. At one point late in the evening, I finally said, we're going to be down to, your dad's going to concede here in a little while. And I mean, in an emphatic way, he said, absolutely not. We still don't have returns from Dallas County, from Tarrant. He said, you tell Dad, hang in there. This thing isn't over. Don't quit. Don't tell him that. Be sure and tell him that. And I never forgot that. And I did convey that to his dad right there, and we did wait a while. And that was, you know, one thing George W. Bush isn't is a quitter. Yeah. So, and I think that conviction, it's been my experience with presidents, what people respect and look for, I think, in a president. They may not agree with them on a lot of issues, but if they feel the individual has conviction and knows where he's headed, they feel better about their president, even if they don't agree with them on a lot of the issues. And I think that's an important trait for any president.
in later years now, they write about the Reagan White House and that he was out of touch, he wasn't involved. Your experience or not?
That is the biggest bunch of science fiction. For years I've read and heard those stories, and Reagan had to read everything off cue cards. That is hokum. That is science fiction. I was with the man on many occasions, numerous occasions, when that certainly was not the case. And I think the people that have perpetuated those stories over the years, they weren't there. Otherwise, they wouldn't have suggested that. I saw just the opposite in Ronald Reagan.
How would you describe him as a leader?
I would say a man of conviction. You knew exactly where he stood. You may not have agreed with it, and I'm talking about people in general now, may not have agreed with his, but boy, you knew where he stood, and you knew that where he was headed. And I'll tell you something, I think we have the situation in the world today. I think Ronald Reagan's legacy was going to be twofold. Number one, that it was that conviction that led us ultimately to glasnost and ultimately to the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. Because he hung tough on his conviction in terms of a missile shield and things that the Soviets finally said, hey, this guy is, he's not changing. And the other thing I think he did was, at a time when it was very important to this country, he restored a lot of our faith and confidence and spirit of this. He raised our spirits when it was important to do that, and he wasn't called the great communicator for nothing.
Why do you think it is people like to knock down their leaders? You see so much of it. Whenever you look back at any of the past presidents of recent time, they always talk about the negative things about their careers. Why do you think that is?
Well, nowadays, Ernie, it seems to me it's not just leaders, it's figures in all walks of life, of all American institutions, sports, business. You see that a lot these days. And I don't know why that is, because you have a lot of people, and it's been my experience over the years, you have a lot of very dedicated people serving in government and the political arena at great personal sacrifice to themselves. They could be off doing something else and having a much quieter, enjoyable life probably, and yet they don't. They submit themselves to the public arena, and I have great respect. I have great respect for anyone who runs for public office at any level. It's not easy anymore, and you do subject yourself to a lot of what you're suggesting. So I don't know why, but I admire those that do it, because nowadays you go through the ringer on a lot of things.
Yeah, I know that we're running short on time, but a couple things I do need to ask you about. Your mom's first ride in an airplane. I love what this is.
My mother got to be 87 years old. She'd never ridden in an airplane, never set foot on an airplane. And so I arranged for her she was invited to go back to Washington on Air Force One from Dallas one time. And so she did. I said, hey, if you're going to take an airplane ride.
This is the airplane.
Yeah, exactly. And it was so funny because she got on the plane, we got airborne, I took her back to visit with the press pool in the back of the plane, and just as we did, we hit this real heavy turbulence, and the plane's going like this, and Helen Thomas said, Ms. Roussel, are you worried? And my mother said, about what?
And she also got along famously with the president.
She did. Of course, she'd been an actress earlier in her career, so I guess it was a case of an actress meeting an actor, a former actor, so I guess there was some communion there. And that she'd also been a reporter.
Yeah.
So, and I was glad I could do that for her at that age. It was late in her life and late in her career. So
now, you've recounted some of your experiences, but in a fictitious manner. Why go that route? You've written Ruffled Flourishes.
Wrote a novel called Ruffled Flourishes, came out recently, and the reason I did was I saw so many things that happened in the White House, often from a humorous standpoint, particularly in the relationship between reporters and those that were spokesmen, such as myself, working for the president. Situations that the public never gets to see and never knows about. And some of them were very humorous, very spontaneous. And I used to sit there when these would occur, and I thought, this would be great fodder for a book. And when the day came that I went to work on it, finally it occurred to me, I said, maybe the way to do it is a novel, is fiction. So that's what I did. But
now you're thinking about doing the biography.
I think I've come to the crossroads, and I'm now going to write my career memoir, a nonfiction book, yes.
How hard is that? Where are you even at in the process?
It's very hard. I remember President Reagan one day, toward the end of his White House tenure, we were saying, Mr. President, you know, they're going to want you to write books. And he turned to us, he said, fellas, writing a book is hard work. And he's right, it is, because you have to do a lot of research, even about your own life.
Yeah.
You have to go back and dig through boxes of things, and it takes a lot of self-discipline. It's lonely work. It's hard work, but I'm going to do it. I come from a family of writers, and I've written one book now, so I think I've got one more left in me here.
And in the 30 seconds we have left, I don't want to leave out one of the presidents. Ford, any impressions on Ford right before we say goodbye?
Probably one of the most decent men I've ever been around. Just a very decent human being who I think was the right person for the job at the time he served, when our country was coming off some major turmoil. I think his personality, his persona, was the right person in the right place at the right time.
Peter, thank you very much.
Thank
Peter
you.
Roussel.